Hey, this is James from the 3-Month Thesis, and in this webinar I'm going to talk about how you can make the transition from researcher to writer, and more importantly how you can minimize the stress while you do that. So of course doing a PhD generally can be pretty stressful, but when you reach the phase of writing a thesis it's a whole other ballgame, and it's not just mental stress that people suffer. Thesis writers can suffer physically as well. You can often actually see those effects in people who've reached that phase of writing the thesis. So people can lose or gain large amounts of weight, or they can suffer physical exhaustion through sleep deprivation. And it's really quite an unpleasant situation to be in. So you can end up with a situation where you have these incredibly clever people who've been successful all throughout their academic career, and then they reach this stage of thesis writing and they just become these pale shadows of their former selves, and you can see them wandering the corridors. It's like they're stuck between this life and the next because they have this unresolved thing. And if only they could finish their thesis, then they could move on. And for this reason, I call them thesis ghosts. And this is the situation which we want to try to avoid by preparing effectively for thesis writing. So just because it's incredibly common doesn't mean it's inevitable or necessary. You can avoid it with some really simple things, but you've got to take this preparation seriously because the negative effects if you don't do it can be really quite unpleasant. So here's the challenge. The challenge is that however good your research, your success depends partly on your ability to write. Not just in terms of content, but also in terms of managing the task so that you don't get so stressed that you can't produce your best work. So because of the size of the task of writing a thesis, effectively you have to become a full-time writer, and that means you need to make some fairly big changes to your routine in order to finish quickly and with the minimum amount of stress. So I'm going to give away the conclusion early, and that is to be a writer you have to isolate writing from pretty much everything else that you do. And here's why. Say for example you set a target for yourself of 500 words per day. So even if you're an extremely slow typist and you have to type with 2 fingers and search for each letter, you'd still be able to write, say, 5 words per minute. That would mean that 500 words would only take 100 minutes, or just under 2 hours. And a fast typist could write 500 words in just a few minutes. But of course you'll know from essay writing that it's really difficult to write that fast. And what this should tell you is that most of the process of writing isn't the physical act of typing. It's thinking, writing, and editing. And the thinking takes most of the time. So most of the time when you're sitting in front of the keyboard, it's thinking which is the crucial part of the whole process. And it's very much a stop-start process. So if you're multitasking, then you'll get distracted, or rather you'll distract yourself at the most critical moments. So when you have to stop and think about what you're going to say next, it's absolutely vital that you're not distracted at those key points. So this is why you have to separate and isolate the process of writing from everything else that you do. So I'll come back to this main point of separating the process of writing from everything else. But first I just want to cover a couple of points which are quite easy to forget when you're engrossed in the thesis writing process. So first of all, it's important to remember, no matter how stressed you are, that the vast majority of PhD students finish successfully. So some quit, some never bother to submit their thesis, and a very, very small number are thrown out. But of all the people who get to the point of submitting a thesis, provided they haven't plagiarized or fabricated their results, the vast majority finish successfully. And if you think about everybody you know who's been through the process, then it's quite clear that the vast majority do finish successfully. The second point to remember is that you're among the top few percent of the population in terms of ability and intelligence. Now, it's easy to forget this because when you're doing a PhD, you're surrounded by other very clever people, whether those are your supervisors or other PhD students. And yet, quite often, students end up with a lack of confidence about their own ability because coming up through school or through undergraduate degrees, if you've reached the point of doing a PhD, then it's almost certain that you were used to being among the elite of any academic group. But when you reach the very, very top, when he reached the point of doing a PhD, everybody else was in the elite as well. And so suddenly you're surrounded by other very, very clever people. And it's very easy to compare yourself negatively to other people within your peer group and to end up thinking you're not good enough, or why don't I have the same results as this other person? You've got to remember that you're here because you demonstrated the ability to perform at a very high academic level. So believe in your ability and believe that all you have to do is get through this final stage of thesis writing and you will succeed. And finally, no matter how daunting thesis writing seems, if you can write 1,000 words, you can write 100,000. At the fundamental level, you're perfectly capable of writing to a high academic standard. But the difficulty comes because thesis writing is on a different scale to everything that you've done before. So the routines you've used, say, to write short essays as part of your undergraduate degree, or even for a master's dissertation, those techniques and routines which you've used in the past might not be the most efficient. You can get away with being inefficient when you only have to write a relatively short essay. But if you're writing a thesis of several tens of thousands of words, then those inefficiencies become multiplied over the whole course of the thesis. And that can ultimately end up taking up months and months of your time and adding extra stress, which is unnecessary. So one prime example of a habit you may have used in the past is to use the all-nighter. So if you have a deadline for an essay, you can get away with procrastinating for 3 weeks and then working all night to write 2,000 words. That can work at an undergraduate level, and you might even produce something which is quite good. But there are two problems with it. First of all, the standard of writing which is required for an undergraduate essay is much lower than that required for a thesis. So something which gets a good passing grade at undergraduate level simply wouldn't be good enough for PhD level. Also, in terms of your productivity, if you procrastinate for 3 weeks and then produce 2,000 words in a single day, your productivity isn't 2,000 words per day, it's 2,000 words per 3 weeks. And you simply can't work like that if you want to finish your thesis fast. So what I'm going to give you in the rest of this webinar are what I believe are the 4 ingredients which are going to help you to be consistently productive, to write fast, and to write well. But they are going to require a change in routine, and it's going to require that you approach work slightly differently. But it will be worth it if you do it. So these 4 aspects of your approach, they reinforce each other. If you get all of them right, then it's more than the sum of its parts, and the effect on your productivity will be phenomenal. Conversely, if any one of these is weak, then it can affect all of the others and lead you down that road of physical and mental stress.